have water all over the time, right? So I think that oftentimes we link it to resources, and of course, not everybody has the same resources to get away from the heat. So how do we talk about solutions beyond just resource-based? So if you could add in the chat or think about what is one way that you can highlight solutions in your outreach? And I'll start with my own. I am a professor. I work on a college campus that is very hot much of the year. And so one of the ways that I've tried to think about heat communication is by just having maps that talk about where the water locations are on campus, right? Water that is available to everybody, water that is not linked to unique resources, right? But mapping out where everybody can get water to stay hydrated. So that's one of mine, but I would love to hear yours in the chat. Okay, so I want to mimic here what Dr. Handula, that quote in the beginning said, which is that heat risk is unique compared to other weather, and we have to talk about it differently for that reason. So 2 years ago, I collected a bunch of Facebook data. So anytime there was a hailstorm, a tornado, or a heat wave, I would go and see what people were saying in response to posts from the National Weather Service to see, if I could track how people talk about or respond to weather differently. Um, Hailstorms, people tend to do this. They tend to give their location and a report. I live in this place. Here's what my hail looked like, right? That's usually how public audiences engage with hail. So you have an example here where someone says there's close to golf ball size hail at 120th and Holly Street in Thornton. So people give reports. When it comes to a tornado, people tend to ask questions. They tend to tag other people or offer information that can keep their communities safe, right? So they'll ask the National Weather Service, what's the timing for the emergency? Because people are trying to figure out how to schedule their lives around the weather event. Or they'll give some advice about previous community knowledge in regarding weather. So here someone shares that you can pull your kid out early if there's going to be a tornado warning to keep your family safe. Each of these hailstorms and tornadoes situations tend to generate people talking about community strategies for staying safe. However, when it comes to heat, we talk about it really differently. And mostly, honestly, what we do is complain, right? Oh gosh, it's going to be heat again, or it's going to be hot again. So here you have an example of a tag and a reaction, right? Hey friend, I've lived here my whole life. These records get set all the time, right? And people laughing about it, or people sharing memes that are funny about the heat. So the way we talk about it makes it less threatening, less scary, and yet it kills more people than any other weather type, right? Nationally and internationally. Okay, so heat risk, because of all the way that we use this language to talk about heat, becomes seen as an inevitable consequence of the environment we live in and part of who we are. So I'm just going to share this quick data. The whole table is not important, but what I want to suggest to you is that I looked at about 4,000 comments about heat in Phoenix specifically. Actually, I also looked in San Diego and saw a lot of these same trends. But the number one thing people tend to do after there's a post about heat is they share a feeling or a reaction, right? Oh, gosh, it's hot again. Um, People will share that meme of the skeleton in the desert, right? And saying it's a dry heat. You see that posted over and over again. 48% of the time, so almost half of how the public talks about heat is just a reaction. About 14% of the time, people were tagging others, which is great. That's how we keep each other safe, is to let each other know about the weather. Sometimes people were comparing or verifying, right? People will share the temperature gauge in their car to say, like, yep, I also participate in this heat, and here's why. You'll notice, though, none of these modes of communication really address how to keep people safe, right? Maybe tagging gets there a little bit, but one of the challenges I work on is how to switch it so that we can get more solution-based communication. And you see some examples here of heat memes, right? So you merely adopted the Arizona heat. I was born into it, molded by it. This kind of communication is a little bit alarming to me, right? Because it says like the heat is just who we are. We should just accept that it's a risk. Another meme that gets shared a lot is "Stop whining about the heat. We are Arizonans," right? And again, I've seen this in New Mexico communications too, maybe a little bit less so than in Phoenix. But people tend to talk about how we internalize heat, and it's almost like becomes a community value. Okay, so those were two, specific examples of Phoenix weather communication, but I see a lot of these same trends nationally. And so I want to share a little bit of research from the New York Times Interactive Heat Map. This is a tool that you can look up if you want. It's going to show you where the heat hotspots are in the country. And what I did is I just collected the public comments on this heat map and coded them for what kinds of things are people saying in regard to the heat maps. And here are the top four things that people tend to do. First, people talked about climate change and politics and sort of linked heat to these larger national conversations, right? So you have an example here from someone who says, I've never been more outraged at the climate denying GOP in Congress than I am now, and that's saying something. The next thing you'll hear are impacts. So you will hear people talk about, what are the consequences of heat? So this was about 16% of the comments. They say people in poor countries starve because of a lack of food and water. Sadly, almost in the same proportion, people just talk about sort of the fatalism of heat, right? Like, oh, this is just who we are. This is just what we've got. We're doomed kind of thing. 14% of the time, this is how people talk about the heat in this data set. So for over 20 years, I've believed that heat is inevitable. I gave up trying to talk to people years ago about it. And then here's what I really want to highlight for you all. Only in 10% of the way that people talk about heat is there a solution presented, right? Or a way to combat the heat other than just accepting it. So here someone says the conversation has shifted around the repurposing of public and private spaces as cooling refuges during heat emergencies, but this requires rethinking the nature of space. So my goal as a communication person is to try to bump up that 10%, right? So if you can think of ways to add those actions into the way you talk about heat, I think that's one way to move forward. So just to show you some examples of how this looks in New Mexico. So these same categories came up when I did just basic searches for New Mexico heat during this last heat wave in March. So this data came from a post on March 19th from National Weather Service Albuquerque about the CPC outlook. And here are some examples of what people had to say. So that same climate change and politics came up, right? So someone says this is an environmental train wreck. Much of the West is in the same boat. There's hundreds of reports about how dire climate change would be if no action was taken. Impacts. So a serious question, are we beyond drought to desertification, right? Are we becoming so far beyond drought that these impacts are going to stick around for longer periods of time? That same fatalism, right? So one person in Albuquerque said, "We're all going to die, RIP," right? There's nothing that can be done. This is just who we are now. There's no going back. And then sometimes solutions. So this was a politician who was tagged in this response. Someone says, "Water's not being replenished. Sir, please consider the forever impacts on our community and our future." So same kinds of patterns in the way that people are communicating about heat, specifically in Albuquerque in this case. So my goal for you, and something that I will continue to say as loudly and to as many people as possible, is if you can embed solutions instead of just the repeated messages of heat communication, we might get closer to keeping people safe out there. Okay, so that was phase one is just language landscape. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about visuals. So we don't just communicate, with text or verbally about heat. We also communicate more and more, especially with social media being such a prominent way of keeping the public informed. We communicate visually. So one of the problems I've encountered out there in the world is that critical information tends to appear as the last thing we mention in visual communication. And this is just because of structurally how we build arguments, right? So typically, let's say you're building an infographic. You might start with, here's the problem. Here's the data that suggests this is a problem. And then we then offer solutions, right? So problem solution is a very common way to communicate issues culturally. The problem is visually, Most people never look at the bottom of a visual. I have some research that I'll get to that shows why that's the case. But something that I think is a really easy fix, and the takeaway here is just to move what to do sections earlier on in the visual space of communication. Maybe you are working in public health, maybe you're making a pamphlet about staying safe from the heat. A super quick fix is just to move the here's what to do language higher in the visual space so that people are sure to see it because people get fatigued. So a question that I will ask of you is what visuals do you currently see in heat communication? So whether it's the weather or something in public health, what kind of imagery tends to be attached to heat communication? And I'm going to see if I can put in the chat one of my favorites, which is the heat man, which talks about heat exhaustion versus heat illness, right? This is one I see over and over again out there in the wild. So we can collect a little small group of what we sort of see out there. Okay, so why am I kind of alarmed about heat visuals? I'll give you a little bit of data or a couple of examples, let's say, about why we see this looking at heat communication. So the way that experts tend to talk about the heat, this research started in 2020 and 2021 when I moved to Arizona, and we were facing dual issues, right? Extreme heat and also the pandemic, because many of our older populations are already vulnerable to heat. When they had to isolate during the pandemic, we were very, very concerned. And so I started looking at, well, how do we communicate about heat? And I started with posts from the National Weather Service. And what I found is that many visuals are about broken records. You see this over and over again, right? A lot of the heat communication is like, oh, we broke another record today. Oh, we broke another record today. And you can see an example of this from March 30th from National Weather Service Albuquerque, right? Here were the record highs.
You were very intentional with the children.
When safety is mentioned in posts like this, it's typically at the end, right? Here's what you can do to keep people safe. Not so much what we would call above the fold, right? It's not the first things people read in these posts. So those messages, I think, are getting out there less than just the fact that we have the broken record. And again, just the takeaway really simply is just to move up the communication about what people should do, to start your message with, here's the solution, rather than to bake it down further into the post where people may or may not read. Okay, a second example. Some of my research involves eye tracking. I'm not going to get into super detail about what all that entails, but basically, I will have people look at a computer screen with different images, and it'll track where their eyes go, in what order, and what parts of the message they see. So gaze plots, you can see an example of here in this extreme heat infographic. It's a numbered basically pathway of where the visual path of a person goes, right? So do they first look at the title? Do they first look at images? This technology helps us track that. And then the second example here is a heat map. So this shows us the visual hotspots of where people look when they're reviewing extreme heat communications. So you can see that people here were really interested in the heat alert language. This red dot shows that people were really fixated on looking at that part of the infographic. But you can see also this section here about beware of the heat is where you get the most information about what to do about extreme heat. And you can see people's eyes don't even land on that, right? People are more fixated on the images. And then areas of interest. So we wanted to see, do people look at images, text, etc., more. What we found through this research is that people spend half their time reading and about 23% of their time on images, but people remembered visuals and images 43% of the time, which to us suggests that images are a really effective way to get the information out about heat safety as opposed to globs and globs and globs of text that people may or may not read. So that's takeaway one. But then the second part that I want to highlight is that we asked how long do people look at the top of an infographic versus the bottom of an infographic. And in the last quadrant, so the bottom quarter of every infographic we looked at, people only spent 15% of their total visual time on that. And again, that is where the safety information was. So just to build on that idea that we should really try to focus on building in what to do about heat earlier on in the visual space. Okay, so my takeaways here, minimize text where you can if you're a person who produces these kinds of visuals. Place key information early in the visual space of the infographic, pamphlet, whatever it is you're designing. Images can often carry more weight for people than text. At least they tend to remember or trigger in their mind visuals more easily. So those are three sort of takeaways about how to enhance visuals about heat communication. The third and last thing I'll talk about very briefly are data tools. And actually, some of the presentations from this morning, Dr. Langer's presentation talked about some of the tools available, and I'll highlight those in a minute. One of the things that I tell people who work on heat communication outreach, though, is that when we only talk about the data and not necessarily the story behind the data, public audiences don't always understand or connect to the messages. So an issue that I've identified is that a lot of our data tools focus on numerical data, but the numerical thresholds shift because heat is so variable for different types of bodies. That when we talk about heat with public audiences, we really need to link that data to something that is based in story. And I thought Stephanie, the last presentation, did such a great job of this, where she was talking about West Nile virus. And then she shared the story, right, of Wilfred Romero and what had happened in his specific case. It's a very effective way to talk to public audiences about heat and get them to sort of invest back. So the takeaway here is that more communication that highlights story is really important when we're doing public outreach about heat communication. And then the question that I'll ask you to put in chat or just, think through for yourself is, do you have an extreme heat story that stands out to you? And I'll give you one of my own. I worked with emergency managers a few years ago to talk about heat communication to outdoor workers and elderly populations in Phoenix. And one of the EMTs that I was talking to said that the majority of calls that they get where they identify extreme heat as a danger have nothing to do with extreme heat. Someone will fall in their house, right? And the emergency team will get called out. And then when they're there, they'll note, like, oh my goodness, it's 90 degrees in this person's house, and then try to intervene, right? But very rarely do they get calls that are just about extreme heat. Um, so when I look at heat dashboard tools, like this is ours in Maricopa County, we have a lot of data about heat-related deaths and environmental temperature. What I like to do is think about the data here and then how to link it to a story, right? So for example, if I'm talking to public audiences about how to stay safe from the heat, I might say, we had 466 confirmed heat deaths. Oftentimes, emergency managers don't know about heat impacting people until it's too late, right? And then I'll share that story about emergency managers. And same with the heat dashboard tools here in New Mexico, right? So again, Dr. Langer talked a bit about this. We can see overall trends, right? So there was that spike in 2023. I think if you're talking to local populations or people that you're working with who you're trying to keep safe from the heat, mentioning here's what happened in 2023 that led to that spike, right? Or here's a news story from that year that highlights what extreme heat looked like in this context. It can help ground these ideas more for people who are trying to navigate how to stay safe. So that's my big takeaway for these tools, is to use this data, which is more available than it ever has been, and try to pair it with what are some stories that will really resonate with people. So these tools are wonderful. They are so helpful for all of us who work in extreme heat. But if we think about taking that data and making it really resonate with people, I think linking it to story is one of the most important ways forward. So just a recap, and then I'll see if there's time for a quick question maybe, and I'll take a look at reviewing the chat as well. Right now, our heat language, the way we talk about heat, tends to lead to inaction, right? We just see it as normal. We talk about it as inevitable. But we know that these deaths are entirely, almost entirely preventable. People have the political will to do something about heat, but that's really only half the equation, right? We really have to give people very specific storylines to act on heat awareness. So instead, we might create more communication about solutions, start with the solutions earlier or the advice or the solve for heat early on in our communication so that people don't miss it. Highlight narratives where we can, and then balance those political conversations with community solutions because we stay safe in more robust communities. I will stop there, everyone. I don't know if there's a quick question I can answer, but let me put up here my first slide where I have my email. You're welcome to email me. I would love to talk to you more about this and just want to say thank you for your attention.
Dr. Lambrecht, thank you so much for sharing on this. We are going to get sucked back into the main room in about a minute. I'd say go ahead and ask the first question, and then if we get cut off, maybe you could continue the response in the chat afterwards, so people could track that.
Definitely.
So go ahead and Veronica, if you want to ask a question.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much, Kat, for your presentation and the work. Yeah, I've just had a question. I've worked in an outreach and engagement before, and so I'm curious what the research you're doing, and then we can probably follow up. But whether you're seeing like if that's all specifically like engagement, like with digital materials, or if you're also doing like specific like in-person engagement or like, those physical materials, like also like how that is being incorporated with how we're like communicating about extreme heat and yeah, climate resilience. So yes, thank you for that. But that was just a little, yeah, more elaborative of the areas you're talking about. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. I'm going to give you my 20-second answer before we're sucked to the other room.
Awesome.
Most of what I talk today is about visual digital signatures, but I also use eye tracking glasses to have people walk around the city and see if they can identify where heat-related resources are. So that's one of the more physical outreach forms that I've looked at up to this point.